Hey, this is Joe with Home Studio Corner. Today we're going to talk about mixing drums, specifically how to EQ drums without all the guesswork and the frustration. Now, everything I teach about mixing makes the most sense in the context of my 5-step mix process. If you haven't heard of that or you're curious as to what that is, I've got a free guide that you can download. Just go to 5stepmix.com to get that now. All right, let's dive in. First things first, new guitar day. This is Gretchen. She is a Gretsch baritone guitar. I've never owned or played a baritone until yesterday. Holy crap, it's amazing. So I'm sure she will make an appearance in the future. So let's talk about what I'm going to talk about right now before we dive into the specifics is something that you're going to be tempted to roll your eyes at. I want to encourage you to refrain because this is probably the single biggest obstacle that holds people back from being able to use EQ well. And that is they don't know their frequencies. They think they know their frequencies, but they don't. I fell into this camp for a long time. Perhaps you don't know them as well as you think you do. So we're talking about EQ, which is a range from 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz. And within that range, there is a vast difference, right? 80 hertz sounds very different from 800 hertz, which sounds very different from 8,000 hertz. So if our goal in using EQ is to identify problems and pull them down, how are we going to be able to do that if we're not even sure what the different frequency ranges sound like? You're going to end up resorting to grabbing an EQ, boosting it, and then sweeping it way up and way down, just kind of hunting randomly for a sound that sounds bad. But the bad news is everything you boost like that and sweep around is going to sound bad. So then you're going to resort to, okay, what sounds the most bad? And you may find one that sounds bad boosted, but that might actually be the problem, might not be the problem that you're trying to solve. So you end up with all these little cuts across your mix because you boosted and heard something that sounded bad, but everything you boost like that is going to sound bad. You see how this becomes a very frustrating problem? There's a better way. So I'm going to talk to you today about how to know and recognize the different frequency ranges on your drum tracks so then you can easily say, oh yeah, that's a problem in the mids. I know exactly what that sounds like. I know exactly how to fix that. Let's go. Can you see how that would generate a lot of confidence in you? Yeah. It's like a superpower. So let's jump in. Here are the raw drum tracks from a song, and we're going to use a plugin that we used in a recent video, Multiband Dynamics, to let us hone in on the different frequency ranges. So I've divvied this up. This is fairly arbitrary, but generally speaking, the lows are 0 to 80, 80 to 250 is around the low mids, 250 to 1K is the mids, 1 to 5K is the high mids, and 5K and up is the highs. You can change these specific crossover frequencies to whatever you think is best, but this is, if you have no clue, I would start here. It's close enough for what we're doing. So now we're going to go through and we're going to listen to each of these ranges and I'm going to kind of help you learn how to critically listen to this stuff so you can identify those problems. But first, let's just listen to the raw drums in their entirety. So that's the raw, unmixed drums. I was going to do this with the mixed drums, but then I realized that might not be as helpful. So these are the raw. There's nothing on these drums. So now let's dive into the specific frequency ranges. And this is on the entire drum bus. If you haven't downloaded that mix guide, you'll see I do a lot of what's called top-down mixing, where I do processing on the drum bus before I ever go to the individual channels. And sometimes I don't even mix the individual channels. So that's a whole theory, like a whole way of approaching mixing that's very different from the way other people do it, but it yields great results and allows you to not have to do too much in the mix, which I love. So we're going to listen to this from the context of the entire drum mix, and we'll kind of dive into more of what that means in a minute. So let's start with the lows. In your head, what does 50 hertz sound like? And if I said, what does 100 hertz sound like? Would you typically answer they're probably the same thing? You might in your head think they're the same. Here's what the low lows, everything below 80 hertz sounds like on a full drum kit. If you're listening on like a phone, you probably didn't hear anything. If you're on headphones or speakers, all you heard was whoom 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 whoom. Mostly just the kick drum going whoom whoom, and then maybe a little bit of the snare, boom, but just barely. So the majority of the tone coming through this low end is the kick drum. If we come over here to a section where he plays a lot of toms, you're still hearing mostly kick drum down there. There's maybe a little bit of that low tom coming through, but it's mostly kick drum. So it's not just mostly kick drum, it's the lowest octave of the kick drum, what we might call sub-bass frequencies. It's the thing that you feel in your chest more than you really hear. So if your mix is missing a lot of frequencies down here, your drums are going to sound kind of wimpy. They're not going to have that punch on a big sound system that you would want them to have. If there's too much down here, it's going to sound boomy, and it might distort things because these low frequencies are just, they have a lot of energy to them. Okay, so that's the low, low, lows. Next, we'll talk of the low mids. This is between 80 and 250. Here's what that sounds like on a full kit. Okay, who are the prominent characters here? Kick and snare, right? Now it's very prominent. Kick and snare are very obvious. This is where the body, the fullness, the warmth, the punch of kick and snare come from. This frequency is really important because that's where you get the nice, I love big, thick drum sounds. If we switch over to the part with the toms, you'll hear the toms are pretty present here as well. Right? All of like the body, the bigness, the thickness, the warmth of the drums comes in at this mid-range area between 80 and 250. Usually around like 120, 150 is kind of where a lot of it is. Versus the lows, you hear the kick and you hear a little bit of that low tom. But then together, this is the full low end with the lows and the low mids. An easy way to think about this is think about octaves. Think about the low mids as being an octave higher than the lows. That's pretty accurate because 50 hertz is an octave lower than 100 hertz. 80 hertz is an octave lower than 160 hertz. So we're right in that ballpark of there's the lowest octave and then an octave up. If you think about it that way, then you can say, okay, what's the problem? If you hear like a boominess or like a muddiness, you might think it's in the low lows, but it's actually in these low mids. This is a crucial spot of your entire mix. So much stuff happens in these low mids, but knowing how they sound, they're a lot higher than, at least for me, by default, I used to think of low mids as being a lot lower. But they're more right here, right? That's not a very low note. It's not down here. That would be the lower frequency. Just hit my microphone. You get what I'm saying? Okay, let's move on to the mids. So the mid-range, 250 to 1K on a drum kit sounds like this. Now, we're not hearing much kick drum at all. Now we're hearing snare, we're hearing toms, and we're hearing a little bit of cymbals now. But what do you notice about the sound of it? It's not very pleasant. I mean, nothing's been that pleasant up to this point. But the word that comes to mind here is boxy. I've told the story in college. I finished a project. I did an audio degree. And when we turned in our final mix, the professor said, the drums sound boxy. And that was it. I didn't know what boxy meant. And I just left the room kind of scratching my head saying, all right, I don't know how to solve that, but I also don't know what it means. This is what that means. Listen, this is literally sounds like you're hitting drumsticks on boxes. With the exception of the ringing of the snare drum, which, by the way, this is where a lot of that happens. It's mostly just, it's kind of flat, doesn't have a lot of life to it. In my experience, cutting these frequencies on a drum kit almost always makes it sound better. So typically right around 400 hertz, doing like a nice wide cut brings everything to life. There's typically too much of this mid-range in the natural sound of the drums that covers up the good stuff, the lows and the highs, which is what we really want to hear. So by pulling those mids down at about 400, you take out some of that boxiness so that those other frequencies can be more prominent. So this is where a lot of that lives. Let's move on to the high mids. What do we hear mostly here? So this is, I think about it as like the heads of the drums. We're hearing the snare head, we're hearing the heads of the toms. Like if you took them off the drums and just hit the drum heads, that's what we're hearing. We're also hearing a good chunk of the cymbals. So like hi-hat, the crash of the cymbals, kind of if there's such a thing as thickness to cymbals, a lot of that's coming in this frequency range. So that sibilant sound that's kind of similar to an SH sound or an S sound in a vocal, that's all coming through here as well. We talked about this with the vocal video. This is where a lot of the nasal sound of a vocal, but also a lot of the sibilant sounds of a vocal come through. Similar experience, right? A harsh cymbal that's got too much in this range sounds similar to a vocal that needs to be de-essed. You could use a de-esser on cymbals, by the way, or probably just some sort of an EQ here would work better. But here's what those upper mids sound like. So if you need to hear more of just the attack of the drum, that kind of snap of just the stick hitting that piece of plastic on the head of the drum, this frequency might be a good place to go. Also the kick of a kick drum. When you hear, all the low end, the whoom whoom, but you might need some of that tick tick on the upper frequencies, especially if it's like a metal song. In here is where you would go find that frequency and bring it out. And finally, the highs. What do we hear up here? I'm always surprised by this, even to this day, at how little exists up here above 5K. So this to me behaves a lot like the same kind of concept of the lows and the low mids. This is like an octave up from the mids, or from the high mids. So the high mids felt like hitting the heads of the drums. This is like taking that and moving it up an octave. So the brighter part of that really, really bright sound to the snare drum that you get, especially on like more pop type records, the airiness of a vocal, the nice shimmeriness of the cymbals, it all exists up here. So this is where if you hear something that's way too shrill, way too bright, or more likely doesn't have enough brightness, coming up here in this range above 5K is probably a place you want to look. And I've said this before, but none of these frequencies are bad. Even the mids, if we took the mids all the way out of this drum kit, it probably would sound weird. Right, there's like life and overtones and coolness in that mid-range. It's too loud, but I don't want to remove it entirely from the drum mix. You made it this far in the video. I've got homework and a gift for you. If you want to go try this on your own, your homework will be go do this exercise on a drum kit. Just set up the kit, run it through a bus, put a multi-band, or you can use a dynamic EQ that allows you to solo different bands. Same principle. And go through and really listen to this. If you don't have drum tracks to mix, I've got some you can have for free. Just go to homestudiocorner.com/MT. M for mix, T for together. That's a series of videos I did where you get the tracks and get to watch the videos of me mixing the songs, and it's all free. Super great. But you can use those tracks to try this exercise. And if you want to go a step further, you can take this same exercise, apply that same plug-in, like this multiband, onto the individual pieces of the kit. So on just the snare drum, and hear what each of these frequencies sound like. On just the kick drum, to kind of hone your listening even further. I like to do it on the bus because it gives me a bigger picture view of the drum sound, because what it sounds like in solo can be very different from what it sounds like in the full mix. So I felt like this was a better, if you had to choose between the two, I would do this exercise and not the other one. Either way, thanks for watching. Hope this was helpful for you. See you in the next one.